Sanjina is going to start the recording here in a minute. And without further ado, I'm turning it over to Lori Frank, our guest speaker today.
Thank you, Anna. So yes, my name is Lori Frank. I was a law enforcement analyst for about 26 years in 2 different police agencies in Colorado. And I found the IALEP sort of late in my career. I kind of wish I had found them earlier in my career. And I ended up, I think, it's been about 3 years ago now, I attended the planner's session, the week-long course. I was fortunate enough to attend that in person. And after that, I got my certification. So I got my advanced law enforcement planner certification about, a year before I left. I've been gone. I retired about a year ago. So when I started my career as a crime analyst, I was fortunate to work under one of the founding members of the IACA, the International Association of Crime Analysts. That was Dale Harris. And Dale and I worked together for about 5 years. I mentored under him. I was very lucky to do that. He went off and started his own company called Corona Solutions. And he started that company with his son after seeing a need to really use and gain knowledge from all of the CAD data that police agencies have at their disposal. So I've been a user of the Corona Solutions applications my entire career. So about a year ago, I was fortunate enough to retire and jump over, and now I work full-time for Corona Solutions as their director of research and analysis. And so for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to turn my camera off, and so I can focus on the screen. This isn't a demo of our applications, but I will rely on screenshots from the platform that we use and how we leverage data in patrol staffing analysis. So what we're going to talk about today is what you can learn from patrol staffing analysis, what data you need to conduct patrol staffing analysis, and what should patrol staffing analysis reveal. I will try to get to questions if I see them in the chat session. I apologize if I don't get to those questions. Hopefully this isn't the last time I'm on the screen, and I will have our website available at the end, and you can feel free to reach out. So, alrighty. So how many officers do you need? This is a very common question. In 2019, the latest data available from the FBI, the national average for US, I know we've got some Canadian members on our site today, is 2.49 per thousand. So our per capita ratio is pretty much the only wide barometer we have out there for how many officers should we need. But this doesn't tell you really how many are in patrol, how many should you need in patrol. So it's kind of it's a nice figure to have, but it's not very useful. So here's just an example. This represents 29 law enforcement agencies across the country. And it ranges on the left to less than 1 officer per thousand to all the way over on the right to more than 2 per thousand. And none of them are as high as the national average that we just saw at 2.49. So this doesn't tell you how many are in patrol or how many are answering calls for service. So patrol represents the largest portion of a typical law enforcement agency. So why should we do patrol staffing analysis? Well, it's probably the largest portion of a budget, and our communities expect us to be fiscally responsible with that budget. So they want us to run our largest portion efficiently and effectively. In addition, does workload change? Well, of course it does. And when things change, we as analysts and planners, we analyze it, right? So we need to adapt to those changes and provide recommendations to adapt to those changes. That's our job. And so we should really be doing patrol staffing analysis at least on a yearly basis. So the most common question that I got was, how many officers do you need? Well, there's a lot of different and correct answers to that question. We need to first ask, to do what? What is it that we want to do? Do we want to handle our workload? So how many officers do we need to handle the workload? Well, what does that mean? What would we measure in order to know, are we handling our workload? Do we have response time goals? How many officers do we need to meet our response time goals? Do we want to provide for proactive time to do community policing? How many officers do we need to do that? Are we looking to reduce overtime? How many officers do we need to reduce overtime? Do our officers feel like they're running call to call? This is very common, something you probably have heard in your agencies. How many officers do we need to alleviate running call to call? What about availability for officer safety for backup purposes? Do people feel like, hey, everybody's busy. If I need backup, nobody's going to be there? Do we have the right schedule? Well, we haven't identified pain points. We need to know what our pain points are, and we need to ask, what is it that we want to do? So the IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, recommends this balanced workload. This is sometimes referred to as the 20-20-20 model, if you've ever seen this. So this means that no more than 20 minutes per hour should an officer spend handling calls for service. No more than 20 minutes spent on administrative duties. And then that leaves 20 minutes of unobligated time for proactive work. So two of these components make up what we consider the demand for service. That is the admin time and the CFS. We have no control over when CFS calls are going to come in, and we have no control over how much time it's going to take to handle those calls, dependent upon the complexity of them. And we need to allow our officers time to do their work, time to write reports, read emails, take breaks, just do business-related activity. And then the remainder of that hour is left over for unobligated. This is where your proactive activity comes in, things like traffic stops and community policing. So in order to move forward, we need to start, we have to have a starting point in order to measure our success. In conducting patrol staffing analysis, we have to have something, we have to know where we're starting from. We can't set goals and plan for our future workload demands without knowing where we are starting. What is our current workload? So what metrics should we use? Why should we use those metrics? And how should those metrics be measured? So anyone that has worked in CAD data and you've pulled CAD data, you know that CAD data is messy. It's not always accurate. Wrong buttons get pushed, things get misclassified, call type lists get long and cumbersome and unusable. But as planners and analysts, if we've dug around in our data, we're fortunate to know that we know our data, and so we know when something's not right. So we can recognize that and we can correct it, because we need highly accurate data to make accurate projections. You know the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. It's the same thing. Incorrect data is going to provide for incorrect projections. So before we start pulling data, let's look at filters. We only want to pull information for patrol units, only patrol units. We only want work conducted by those whose primary responsibility is responding to calls for service. So we don't want supervisors in there. They may assist and they might show up on a call, but we don't want that workload counted in our demand for service. So we don't want lieutenants or watch commanders. We don't want sergeants. We don't want specialized units. Our SROs, they might be responding to calls for service at schools, but they don't typically leave the school to respond as an available unit. And we might have a geographic filter. Perhaps we have an area of our jurisdiction, like a downtown or an entertainment district, where officers only work that particular area. We may want to apply that geographic filter as well. Next, before we've started pulling data yet, we want to differentiate between calls for service and officer-initiated activity. So how do you pull this information? You can use call source, but I have found that call source can be very unreliable. So I would recommend hard coding certain call types. You always want to count, for example, a robbery as a call for service. And you always want to count a traffic stop as an officer-initiated event. So there are certain calls that no matter what their call source says, or if you don't use a call source, perhaps you use a time lapse threshold, maybe a time lapse between en route and arrive. If that's less than 30 seconds, then we're going to call that an officer initiated, because there are calls within your data that that can be counted either way, but there are certain calls that you want to hard code one way or the other. So now that we have our filters in place, we're going to start with some metrics that most of us can easily obtain. Call counts, CFS call counts. So how many calls did patrol units respond to? Officer initiated call counts. Same as CFS, but how many calls did officers themselves initiate? And while that's not part of that demand for service, it's going to tell us how much time we've been able to devote to proactive work. Response times. So we want to measure response times to both emergency and non-emergency calls. Anybody that's worked in CAD data and done performance measurements, you've probably done this a bunch of times, pulled these metrics and done some measurements. Talking about response times. Response time calculation has everything to do with priorities. So priority is meant to define the response protocol. So your top priority, in this example, a 0, would be your most serious call. That's going to dictate how are you responding to that call. So you want to look at your data. How many priorities are there? And is there a need for that many priorities? Are your calls correctly prioritized? Because this is going to muddy and make that data even messier. The fewer priorities you have, the better. And what percentage of your calls are the highest priority? You can see in this example that less than 1% of the calls fall into that top priority. That's a good indication that those are reserved for the most serious calls that you're running code to. You want to look at the timestamps and keep those consistent. So what values are you using to calculate your response time from when to when? And you want to keep those consistent over time so you can measure over time any indications of trouble within your response times. Non-emergency response times. Non-emergency calls make up the bulk of any agency's workload. So this is where you're going to have the most interaction with your community. This is going to be how your community values or gauges or evaluates the level of customer service that their police agency gives them. In this example, about 80% of the workload falls within that priority 2 and 3. And back to how many priorities are there? Well, in this example, there's 7 different priorities. And if you look at the 5 and 6 priority, such little amount of call volume occurs there. Are those really needed? This is a time to really evaluate what are your priority lists doing for you. And then mean versus median averages. When you're calculating response times, you definitely want to use a median average because it eliminates the anomalies and it's not influenced by extreme values, which especially at that top priority level are rarely accurate. So overall averages in response time are important, but they're not going to reveal any pain points hiding in the data. And we want to be able to break out the various components that make up our overall response time. This is especially true if you're using a comm center that isn't run by your own agency. If you're in a shared comm center kind of situation, you want to be able to break these out so you can isolate if there are issues, Is it at the dispatch level or is it at the officer availability level? So in this example, we're showing an impressive dispatch to arrive time of less than 5 minutes. So this is pretty much our travel time. So the officer is getting there pretty quickly. However, at the 75th and 90th percentile in our entire response time, so this is hello to hello, we see that we've got some trouble spots. And in our non-emergency time at the 90th percentile, this says that 90% of the time, an officer is responding in less than an hour and 20 minutes to that lower level call. That can be a long time to wait, especially if this is going to be your level of customer service that you're providing to that agency. So some metrics that might not be so easy to gather. We need to collect time and the time spent. So more important than, say, the number of calls is the time spent handling those calls, because handling a lot of simple short calls is very different than handling a very few more complex calls. Our resource demand is that time consumed. So this isn't a simple calculation taken from, say, the time is dispatched or the time that the officer arrives on the call to when the call is closed. Each officer that responds to the call must have their time calculated separately. This is a one-to-many relationship, meaning one call can have many officers respond. So instead of looking at time as, say, linear, you need to look at time as stacked on top of each other. So we're going to grab the time spent on every call for every officer that responded and stack it on top of each other. And then the same goes true for officer initiated activity. We want to do the same thing. So our calls for service hours, the time that we spend, that's part of our demand. So officers oftentimes will make multiple trips to the same call. So say they go out, they initially handle the call, they're on scene, they clear the call, and then they return to the call. They may not return to the call physically, but they return to it virtually to do more work on it. Maybe they're making phone calls, maybe they're doing some paperwork, but they have multiple trips to the call. And these trips need to be segregated and calculated separately, because if not, all of the time in between will get counted and that will skew our calculations. And this needs to be done for every officer that responds on those calls. So in this example, there were 3 trips that this particular unit made to the call. They initially respond, they clear, they go back to it, they clear, and finally they go back to it a 3rd time and they clear it and they close it. So between those 3 trips, they spent a total of 1 hour, 51 minutes, and 38 seconds. Had we just done the initial arrive to the last clear, we would have calculated 5 hours, 27 minutes, and 35 seconds, very much skewing how much time this particular call demanded. Okay, now the other part of our demand is the admin time. And I can tell you, this is always consistently poorly tracked and very much underreported. So this is the time that is required for officers to do their job. They need to write reports, they need to gas up their vehicle, they need to take breaks, they go to trainings, whatever the case may be. This is the business side of it. So we need to be able to track this. Hopefully somewhere in your CAD system, you guys are tracking admin time. And it's really beneficial if officers don't underreport this. So in this example, in our first period of time, an average of 74 hours was spent by each officer writing reports. And in the second period of time, that was close to 95 hours. And the average time they spent on each of those report writing, about 62 minutes. Well, If I'm an analyst or a planner, I know my data, and 62 minutes sounds reasonable for an officer to write a report, but it's an hour per report and 74 hours and 95 hours. That seems very underreported to me. I bet you that officers are doing more than 74 reports or 95 reports. So we know by looking at this that we've got some underreporting occurring here. We also need to take into account lost time. So the time that they're going to be completely away from the schedule. That could be for vacation, for sick, military leave, personal leave, injury leave, etc. So just like before, when we did our unit filter, we only want to evaluate patrol officers. We don't want detectives' time away. We don't want command staff's time away. We only want to look at what patrol officers have been taking, and we want to grab this, an average for at least a year, and we want to refresh this information on a yearly basis. So in this example, based on all of the information, they were absent an average of 665 hours. So if we take 665 hours away from what they were scheduled, so we'll just use 2080 here, that leaves 1,415 hours that we can expect them to show up, which means we've got a 68% availability. So we can expect an officer to show up for their scheduled shift 68% of the time. That's going to be very important when we start allocating our resources. So now we've got a historical summary of our time spent. We've got 2,080 hours scheduled. We've got a 68% appearance factor, which leaves 1,417 expected hours that they worked. So of those 1,400 hours, we can see that 43.6% was spent on CFS activity. So we already know right now that they're probably busy because that's more than the recommended 33.33% from the IACP. 19.6% was spent on admin related activity. We know that's probably underreported. And we've got 14.7% spent on officer initiated activity. And so these are the activities and actions that we're actually able to collect from CAD. The remainder of those 1,400 hours equates to about 22% of the time, which is our untracked, which means it's just not logged. It doesn't mean they're not busy. It just means there's no electronic measurement of that 22% remainder. So now that we have a starting point from which to work when we attempt to evaluate how we're going to move forward towards our operational goals. So we've built our starting point. We've created our historical picture. So can we answer these questions yet? Are we handling the workload? Have we met our response time goals? Have we reduced overtime? What about backup availability? Have we provided for proactive time for community policing? Do they still feel like they're running call to call? Do we have the right schedule in place? We can't answer this yet because we haven't identified pain points. We need more detail. We need to take a microscopic look at our data in order to expose those pain points. So we need to evaluate the demand on a daily and hourly basis. So there's 168 hours in a week. And we want to look at the demand placed on each officer for each hour, because it will be dependent on how many officers are actually on duty during that hour. Every hour is going to require different resources, and it's subject to how many are on duty. So for each of the 168 hours, we need to know what the demand is. And our demand is our calls for service time and our admin. So the same metrics that we pulled for our summary, we now need to pull for each hour, because this will help start to recognize those pain points. So if we look at calls for service per hour, we can start to recognize when is it that we are seeing some pain points, that they might be running call to call, that they might be lacking availability of backup officers. We can look at tempos of activity. We can identify high activity times and low activity times and start to identify pain points. Admin time. We need to collect admin time when it's actually occurring. So higher admin times are usually recorded at the beginning and at the end of shifts. So after officers attend briefings and before they hit the street to start answering calls, they tend to spend some time conducting business-related things. They read emails, they acknowledge policy, etc. And this is especially true if it's their first day back on the schedule. So again, that same figure, we can't use one figure across all 168 hours. That won't allow you to see when the workload may overcome your resources. We need to get as accurate as possible. We need to see when that admin time is occurring. So in this example, admin time is logged in the 6 to 7 hour. So across the bottom, we've got our hours of the day, and each line represents a different day of the week. And then across up the left, that's the minutes that they're logging. So our admin time in the 6 o'clock hour is high. That's likely due to there's probably a shift change around there, and it's much lower in the 16 and 1700 hours, probably when our CFS activity is higher, and so they're unable to conduct admin duties. So it's not evenly distributed across a shift. It's not like you can say, okay, you're going to have 30% across your whole shift, so apply that same number across every hour. It's really important to see when it's actually occurring. In our summary report, we provided overall response time averages, but we didn't reveal any pain points that existed within that data. If we look at response times at the hourly level, we can start to expose hours in the week when response times might struggle. If we're capturing demand when it actually occurs, that's what's critical to meeting that demand. So we can't lump all of the time that a call takes into the hour in which it was received. We need to look at when the work on that call was actually being completed. So this is going to be important when you develop a schedule. So this graph is showing me how many minutes of calls for service work rolled from 1 hour to the next hour. So end of shift times are going to be important here if we want to avoid holding people over on overtime. So for example, Friday and Saturday mornings, CFS work rolls into the next hour and is high from 0500 through 0700. So an end of shift time of 6 a.m. would hold them until 7 o'clock to finish up. So perhaps we should move our EOS time to 7, which might be a little more beneficial and economical for our officers. So we've gotten a detailed analysis of our demand. We can start to identify where our pain points are. And if we want to handle our demand on an hourly basis, we need to know what our resources are at that same level. So how many officers are scheduled for each hour? And due to our lost time, how many officers are expected to show up at each hour? We need to apply our resources to our demand for every hour. So this is where the schedule comes in. So the schedule is what we can use, and it's our gear in the middle that we can turn to match our staffing with our demand. We need to apply our resources proportionally to that demand. So our demand is evaluated based on 168 hours of the week. The application of our resources must also be based on the 168 hours of the week. So a little bit about proportional and flat staffing. In proportional staffing, the number of officers applied to the schedule is proportional to the workload. It doesn't rotate outside of that 7-day week. So it takes into account the day of the week and the hour of the day. So some examples of this: 4 10s, 5 8s, a 3 12s, and a 1 8 within a 2-week period. Those are all examples of a proportional staffing model. A flat staffing model, on the other hand, so the days that you work and the days that you're off rotate on a non-7-day basis. So the number of officers working is not tied to the day of the week. And a real common shift pattern in flat staffing is called the Pittman schedule. This would be where you're 2 on, 2 off, 3 on, 2 off, 2 on, 3 off. Proportional staffing can be built to match your workload. Flat staffing cannot, because it rotates outside of that 7-day cycle. Here's an example of flat staffing. So if we looked at a 2-week period, so on the left is day 1, and on the right, that's our 14th day, and the number of officers scheduled goes up the left-hand side. So the blue line represents the number of officers that we would need to match our workload for every single hour, and the red line represents the number of officers that we have scheduled over that 2-week period. So the goal is to match the red line as close as possible to the blue line and minimize the spaces in between them. So when the red line is below the blue line, we're understaffed in that particular hour. And when the red line is above the blue line, we're overstaffed in that hour. Sorry, I might have mixed that up. Red line below is understaffed, red line above is overstaffed. So in this example, there's several understaffed periods and several overstaffed periods. Proportional staffing, so it rotates inside that 7-day week. The cadence is the same and the spacing is much closer. It's not an exact match, but it's a lot closer. So when you're trying to match your schedule to your demand, the schedule and the allocation to the teams within that schedule is the gear in the middle that you can turn in an effort to get the number of officers scheduled as close as possible to the optimal number of officers needed. So you can adjust shift start times. You can adjust allocation to your teams. You could try a completely different schedule configuration. There's a lot of options available when you're trying to find the best match. So when we have a schedule in place, what is the impact to the demand of each officer? So for each schedule iteration that we have and each adjustment we make, we can look at what will be the projection. So on this particular schedule, our projected demand, that's our CFS and our admin time for each officer for every day of the week, the majority of the time, it's not exceeding 40 minutes. So that's our 20 minutes of CFS and our 20 minutes of admin. The majority of the time, it's not going to exceed that. This would not be overtaxing on our patrol staff. What would the schedule have? What would the impact to the response times be on the schedule that we want to look at? So for each schedule iteration and adjustment on this schedule, our projected response times to non-emergency calls for each day of the week and each hour of the day the majority of the time, our response to those non-emergency calls will be under 15 minutes. So this schedule would allow us to meet that non-emergency response time goal and show us where we might see slightly longer response times. How many officers do I need to meet operational goals? It's always dependent upon the schedule. So on this particular schedule, if we wanted to have an average of 20 minutes per officer per hour for an average of those 168 hours of the week, we would need 119 officers. And if we wanted to provide at least on average 2 officers available in case we needed that backup response, we would need 77 officers. So let's revisit our initial question. How many officers do we need? Well, now can we answer those questions? Well, to do what? Now we've looked at, well, to provide 20 minutes of proactive time, to meet response time goals, to say reduce overtime. Can we handle the workload? Are we handling the workload? Our summary provided a good indication that we're a little bit busier than the recommended 33 1/3%. Would we know what to measure? Now we do know what to measure on an hourly and per officer basis. Can we reduce overtime? Well, perhaps by moving our shift end times, our EOS, we might be able to reduce some overtime from holdovers. Can we meet response time goals? Well, we saw with that schedule, say we had a 15-minute non-emergency response time. We could meet that with the exception of a few hours where we might see some longer response times. Can we prevent them from running call to call? Perhaps if we just redistributed on a different schedule, we could alleviate some of that running call to call. Can we provide proactive time to do community policing? Well, we saw in meeting our goals, trying to meet our operational goals, we would need 117 officers in order to provide 20 minutes. Can we provide availability for backup for officer safety purposes? On our current schedule, we would need 77 officers to have at least 2 people on average available for backup response. Do we have the right schedule? Now we can answer that question. All of these questions are very dependent on the schedule and the allocation you have in place. So do we have the data to answer these questions? We now have the data to answer those questions. So this is the Corona Solutions approach to answering those questions with our website there. And now I will open it up for, I guess, questions in the chat session, I think. I know that was a lot of information to throw at you guys at once, and it went very, very quickly. I apologize for that. With doing this online and not being able to do it in person, it's just a little bit different for me.
Lori, if you'd like, I can read some of the questions in the chat.
Yes, that would be fantastic.
When all of our officers are tied up, our patrol sergeant will handle calls for service as a primary officer if there's no one else available. How would you try to capture that?
Well, in the application that I used, in the Corona Solutions application, and I used this when I was an analyst, we can provide, basically it says, it asks you the question, if you have a high priority call, say a priority 1 call, and you don't have any officers available, can you find someone, i.e. a sergeant, to send to that? And yes, you can. Because it doesn't hopefully happen very often, you wouldn't want to pull that data to look at it as part of your normal workload. We're hoping that doesn't, if it happens so often that your patrol sergeant is basically a primary responder, then you would want to include that sergeant as part of your filter to pull the data.
Please repeat why we should use median averages?
Because they're not, because it basically excludes those extreme values. So when I would do response time analysis, especially to priority 1 calls, and I'm using priority 1 as the most emergent call priority there, you would see a response time of, say, like 26 minutes. Well, digging into it, I knew that that wasn't accurate. So it throws that value out, and it only uses, especially when you're doing response time analysis on the top priority calls, it throws those anomalies out. Like say you had like a 30-second response time. That's probably not likely that you had somebody that close to the call that responded that quickly. So when you use the median average, it throws those out and it doesn't use those extreme values and won't skew your average.
Can you explain how to calculate the median average? Is there a formula for it?
There is, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but I can tell you, if you just go in and Google median average, it will do it for you. And it does it in Excel too. Excel allows you to pick which type of mean, median, or mode average you want to calculate.
Okay. One of the questions is a recording of the session, about recording the session. The session is currently being recorded and will be on the website.
Okay.
Going through the chat, trying to see
Sure.
if I may have missed some. How do you capture the rollover time on CFS?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I don't know the algorithm behind it. I know that we capture it. That's part of, it's in the application. But I don't know the formula behind it. So I'm sorry, I can't provide that.
Could you please elaborate on benefits of hard code certain call types, e.g. traffic stops?
Well, so a traffic stop should always be considered an officer initiated activity. And I hope I'm going down the right path to answer this question. So when you're looking at hard coding call types, you really want to differentiate between the demand, and remember the demand is made up of the calls for service and the admin. You really want to isolate that demand. So a traffic stop is pretty much discretionary. So if an officer is responding to a code, they're responding code to a top priority call, and they see somebody blow a stop sign, they have the discretion to not stop that person. They have that ability to make that decision. So it's officer initiated activity is what would be considered discretionary. Whereas calls for service, you don't have the option. If somebody calls and says, I need the police and I want the police here now, you don't have the option to say, I don't feel like going. So those are the calls that you really need to isolate as your calls for service and your demand for service. Whereas those on the officer initiated side, if they're discretionary at all, you want to isolate those as officer initiated. So I hope I answered that correctly.
Can you talk a little about geography and projecting for changes? For example, we are looking at completely changing our patrol zones and districts, but our current CAD data is tied to our existing geographical boundaries.
Well, hopefully within your geographical layers in CAD, you've got a layer in there in which you can use as like a building block. When I would ever go through, say, a redistricting type of exercise, the layers of geography, so you've got your point data, and then that point lies within hopefully you have some sort of next layer up. We called them reporting districts. It was a smaller geographical area, like if you take a neighborhood and you maybe divide that neighborhood up into, say, 4 or 5 different puzzle pieces. And then those reporting districts lie within your patrol area, your patrol district, your patrol beat, whatever your nomenclature is for using that in that particular layer. If you have data at that reporting district level, then you can use that data to complete your redistricting, even though, so you're going to create a new next layer up. You're going to create a new district or a new beat layer, but it's going to be made up of those building blocks. So when I would do redistricting, basically the rule of thumb was you can put the puzzle pieces and divide the whole puzzle up however you want, but you can't cut a puzzle piece. You have to adhere to the boundaries of that puzzle piece, i.e. the reporting district.
Is there a way to do workload studies for divisions other than patrol? Just wondering, because if an agency is doing a workload study to justify their request for increased budget to fund more officers, then doesn't it need to take into account what everyone in the agency is doing with their time?
Absolutely, it does. And unfortunately, there's no good answer for that. So the first line of police response is going to be patrol. They're shouldering the bulk of a police agency's work. That's why they're the largest, and that's why they have the biggest portion of the budget, because the time spent that patrol officers spend on scene dealing with things is the largest portion of any time spent in a police agency. So the next, when you get up to, say, the detective level, the only way to, do a staffing or a manpower analysis at that detective level, I've not seen an agency yet that tracks activity at the detective level close enough to do any sort of real staffing analysis. Now, the benefit of doing patrol staffing analysis is that most of the time, we'll cross our fingers that, all of our CFS activity is logged, and hopefully the majority of our admin activity is logged, that we've got an electronic record of how patrol spends its time. If there's no electronic record of how people spend their time, then it's going to have to be based on, anecdotal data. Like, how long does it take detectives to interview people, and how many interviews do you do for a case, and how many cases do you do a year, etc. And then you could look at perhaps clearance rates. How many cases is the Detective Bureau clearing, and can you tie that back to how many detectives you have? So the only way to really provide an evidence-based solution to staffing is at the patrol level, unless you've got a really robust case management system that your Detective Bureau is using and they're diligent about tracking their time.
What would be the purpose, benefits of tracking hourly roll over time?
I don't think I understand that question.
Okay, hopefully Frank Z will give a little more explanation.
Okay.
The next one is, this analysis seems to fit the mold of a smaller agency. Is there anything different that you would do for an agency of 1 to 3K plus officers with multiple divisions and millions of CFS per year?
Well, it's actually very, very scalable. So how you would apply it depends on how you schedule your patrol officers. So if you schedule for your entire jurisdiction, then you would do a workload analysis on the entire jurisdiction. If you've got a jurisdiction that is so large that you've then you've subdivided it into different, precincts, districts, whatever you want to call them, and you schedule for those at that level, then you basically do a workload analysis. It's like pretending that you've got little mini cities within your entire jurisdiction. And so you would isolate the workload to that district level and then apply the schedule and the resources that are allocated to that particular district or beat and look at it that way. So it becomes, it's extremely scalable. I mean, this has applied to agencies that have fewer than 50 officers to agencies that have more than 1,500 officers.
Okay, Frank C. has given more of an explanation, so I'll read the original question, then I'll read the clarification. What would be the purpose benefit of tracking hourly rollover time? I was referring to the line chart of rollover minutes from 1 hour to the next.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the rollover time, so this gets back to at that, for the 168 hours, you have to know what the demand is for each 168 hour. So if you just pull, okay, say this call takes 90 minutes to complete, one officer used 90 minutes to complete the call, and you put that time in the cell in which the call was received, then you're going to push all 90 minutes into that particular cell. Well, let's say the call was received at 9:50 a.m. and it took 90 minutes to complete. So the officer gets there and spends from 9:50 to 10 a.m. on the call, but then spends the entire 10 o'clock hour on that call. The bulk of the demand was in the 10 o'clock hour, not in the 9 o'clock hour. And so if you only use the hour in which the call was received, you're placing that demand in the, not in the hour in which it was actually required, but you're artificially moving it back to when the call was received, not in the hour in which it was actually conducted.
Those are all the questions.
Okay. Fantastic. The timing looks pretty good here. We're at almost at the top of the hour. I can tell you, if you guys have any further questions, I don't know why, but I didn't put my email address on here. It's Lori, Lori .Frank, FRANK at coronasolutions.com, the same as what you're seeing on the screen. So if you have any questions, follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer those.
Okay, thank you so much, Lori. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your email address also in the chat box.
Oh, fantastic.
I got it right.
Good. Okay, thanks.
You might want to double check.
Okay, I'm trying to see.
And I want to thank everybody that has joined us today, and especially of those that are not currently IALEP member. I would encourage you to visit our website. It's www.ialep.org. Our membership fee is $50 a year, and that provides you access to a member forum where you can pose any kind of questions on projects you're working on, pick other people's brains, and you have a pretty interactive session there where people chime in and give you pointers and tips. Also, with our membership, you get access to the Justice Clearinghouse. And that website has tons of webinars on law enforcement topics. Some of them are recorded historical documents, and others, they typically have at least one webinar a week that are educational, professional development in law enforcement. That alone is $119 a year value. So if you join us, you get a pretty good bang for your buck. So IALEP is really there to form relationships, to help each other through the unique job of law enforcement planning. One of the announcements that we have that is not necessarily educational, we are doing our very first ever IALEP Social Happy Hour, and that is going to be on May 20th from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern. So you can go on our website and register. Jennifer Gottlieb, if you're still on here, if you want to talk a little bit about the happy hour.
Hello, we haven't come up with the agenda yet, but we will be doing that shortly and we can send out that information. But we're hoping to get people together to be able to network and socialize in the absence of being able to gather in person and conferences. We would just like to get to know some of our members across North America. So we really encourage you to come and join us. We don't have to stay for the full 2 hours, but it would be wonderful if you could drop in and we could get to know you. So thank you very much, Anna, for bringing that up.
Thank you, Jennifer. And also, I know everybody is kind of working on budget for 2022. So IALEP unfortunately has not been able to do a conference in 2020 due to COVID. And with agencies having very limited travel budgets in 2021, there's also not going to be an in-person conference, but we are planning an in-person conference for 2022 in Colorado Springs. We do not have the exact dates of the conference. We're still in the early planning station, whatever, I can't talk today. So anyhow, in 2022, we're going to have an in-person conference in Colorado Springs, and please plan accordingly. And with that, I think that's the official part of the conference, and we can cut out the recording. And if people want to stay on,